Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder. Today on the show, the candidates have been nominated. The ads have started to roll out. The federal campaign of 2015 is on. Federal Liberal candidate Arif Virani joins us to talk about how the Liberal campaign is kicking it into high gear. And Queen's Park has adjourned until September. Rob Ferguson from the Toronto Star talks about the highs and lows from this most recent session of the 41st Legislature. All that and more on this edition of The Point. Candidates are knocking on doors across the city in anticipation of the upcoming federal election. It promises to be a bruising race of endurance. Polls show that all three parties are pretty well tied. Arif Virani is the Liberal candidate in the riding of Parkdale High Park. Arif, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Marcel. I'm glad to be here.
So the campaign, although not officially on, is actually on. We've already seen the campaign ads starting to roll out. The various tours are going on. What's happening in Parkdale High Park?
There's a lot happening in Parkdale High Park, to be honest. We've been sort of at the doors and engaging with voters since back in February, actually. So we're certainly not waiting for a writ to drop to be active. I think it's important that people know that there's an election coming up. It's a very important election. People are geared up to vote this time. The riding itself votes a little bit higher than the norm, which I find great because people are quite engaged. But we've opened a campaign office. We've hosted events. We had a roundtable immigration discussion on dealing with John McCallum, where John McCallum came and visited us. So it was terrific in terms of some of the outreach we've been doing. We're having a candidate picnic coming up on July 1st. So things are rolling in Parkdale High Park, and it's good to see because I think the residents appreciate it.
Now, we saw in the recent provincial election that the NDP candidate, Sherry DeNovo, just barely held on in that campaign. Does that give you any boost or confidence that things might change federally?
I'm glad you're aware of that because I'm often communicating that at the doors, the riding was decided by 525 votes in the provincial election last year. That translates to over 300 polls, 1.7 votes per poll. So that means Marcel and his spouse stay home one night. Well, that's the 2 votes in that poll that could have swung the riding. Because I think it's important because to the extent you do encounter cynicism from the voters, I emphasize that every vote counts, and here's the proof. The proof positive is that it was 2 votes per poll in the very last election. And people start to think, okay, well, I'm going to make sure I do vote, and if I'm not going to be here, I'm going to vote at the advanced polls, etc. But that demonstrates the malleability of the electorate in Parkdale High Park, and I think that's a good thing for democracy, and it's a good thing for the Liberal Party's fortunes going forward.
So talking about your riding, it's a very interesting riding that you have. You have some very areas of low income, and you have some areas of very high income, and you straddle everything in between there. Yeah. How are you able to bridge those different divides?
You're right. It's a classic sort of microcosm of sort of an urban center anywhere in this country. But in terms of me personally, I'm not a person who came from a lot of means. I'm a refugee from Uganda who came here as part of the Idi Amin exodus in 1972. When I speak about that experience to a newcomer who's Tibetan or Roma in Parkdale, that resonates with them because they understand that this is a person who not only sympathizes with their situation but can empathize with it. So our first port of call was the YMCA in downtown Montreal. Right, we were given clothes for the Quebec winter. So my parents have these romanticized memories of it, but it was a very difficult time. But what I like about sort of that sort of model is that what happened is that my parents found work. They were benefited by the settlement programs that used to be plentiful. They got their kids in public school, and lo and behold, my sister and I both ended up at McGill on scholarships with part-time jobs. And I got through McGill, then I went to U of T's law school, and that to me is it sounds a bit cliche, but that sort of narrative is supposed to be what this country is all about, providing those kinds of opportunities. What I find most disheartening is that when I speak to those folks in Parkdale, they're not seeing those kinds of aspirations for their children. What they're seeing is very visceral challenges. How do I get my son through school and on the right side of the law, as opposed to how do I get my son or my daughter potentially aspiring for public office? And that to me is the deficit of national aspirations that we need to remedy by changing the government.
How would a Liberal government tackle these types of issues? We've only heard a limited amount from Justin Trudeau in terms of how he's going to tackle. He talked about fairness, about the middle class. but not much more.
It's partly just rendering fairness within the immigration system. So it's the due process within that system. It's things like, on a very micro level, it's things like, if you recollect, the cuts to medical care for refugee applicants, which was perceived to be heavy-handed by most observers. It was actually struck down by the courts as a Section 12 violation of the Charter, a decision which was since appealed by Stephen Harper. But its efforts to reach out to those communities to demonstrate that the party, that the government, via the Liberal Party, is welcoming of those individuals, welcoming of their contributions. It's trying to do right by people who are foreign trained professionals who are finding difficulties in terms of their accreditation process. But the Liberal Party is keen on ensuring that we are both open to newcomers, but also doing right by them once they arrive. And a very tangible case in point is the response to what's going on in the Middle East in terms of Syria and Iraq. The Liberal Party took a strong stand to say, no, we are not going in and expanding that mission into Syria. What we should be doing in Syria is doing what we did for the Ugandan Asians 42 years ago when a guy like Arif showed up, which is that we're opening the doors. So the Liberal Party wants to bring in 25,000 Syrian refugee applicants immediately, indiscriminate of their religion, which I find the most specious component of what's going on right now, is that the government currently is cherry-picking who can come in based on certain religious minorities that happen not to be Muslim, which, you can read into that what you want, but to me it's pretty clear what sort of dynamic is at play.
One of the knocks against the current Conservative government is that when it comes to human rights, they turn a blind eye.
It's quite alarming, to be honest. To my mind, the sort of the standard that Canada upholds is a standard that is internationally recognized. It goes back to our involvement in drafting the UN Charter, which if I recollect correctly, was drafted by an old McGill law prof. And that tradition was a strong tradition and had always been a strong tradition. What you find right now in terms of Canada and its work abroad is that we are being internationally isolated as opposed to internationally welcomed. We are being labeled as a polarizing nation that is not engaging with other nations, and our human rights record has fallen woefully behind. And I think the case in point is that these trade missions and these business practices, they weren't invented by Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party. Sort of the Team Canada missions were sort of a Chrétien phenomenon. But what I always appreciated was that Jean Chrétien would lead those missions and then establish relations over a power deal with China, but it would be used as a beachhead in order to engage with the Chinese government or Chinese officials on their civil liberties policies or their human rights policies. That has entirely fallen by the wayside, and that's to the detriment of both the people in those countries, but also to Canada's stature. On the human rights front, I mean, the list is long in terms of some of the egregious violations we have. I mean, a case in point is, again, this past week, the response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in terms of trying to do right by the historic legacy in this country vis-a-vis Aboriginal people. And Stephen Harper was conspicuously silent, as opposed to, I was quite proud with Justin Trudeau's stand that it wasn't looking at some of those recommendations, it was all 95 of those recommendations need to be implemented.
You're facing Tom Mulcair and the NDP, Peggy Nash, and they just came off a stunning win in Alberta, where the Orange Wave took Rachel Notley into the Premier's office. How big an impact is that going to have, and how are you dealing with your NDP counterpart?
So that's an interesting question, and I'll confess to you it's come up at the door, but I usually have a discussion with people when people ask me, Arif, what do you think about that Alberta result? And for people who followed it, I presume you would have followed it as a journalist, and I was following it as a candidate, obviously, but that election actually had very little, if anything, to do with the federal NDP. You may or may not be aware that Rachel Notley actively distanced herself from Tom Mulcair. He was not permitted in Alberta, largely because the individual himself is not a particularly popular figure because of his energy policy stands in Alberta. So what that was an anti-Jim Prentice vote, an anti-Conservative vote, and they turned to a person who they thought was a plausible alternative. I'm very happy and very enthused that people are turning away from the Conservative message, even in the Conservatives' backyard. That's an encouraging sign. I think it's fantastic for democracy that you can have that kind of renewal, but I don't see it as a threat in terms of a national NDP bulwark, and I think people who analyze it see it exactly for that is not a portent of things to come nationally.
What are the key issues that you knock at the door talking to people about?
So it relates to the economy, as I mentioned earlier on. It also relates to the environment. That is a very strong issue in my riding. The riding is bordered by 3 train tracks and Lake Ontario, a river and 3 train tracks. One train track runs right alongside Lake Ontario. There's a strong concern about rail safety and about transportation regulation, a matter of classic federal jurisdiction. The Lac-Mégantic train ran right through my riding before it ended up in Lac-Mégantic and turned into a ball of fire, consuming nearly 50 lives. There is an issue that needs to be addressed immediately in terms of the safety of those rail cars, in terms of the flammability of the contents, in terms of the frequency by which they are passing through various communities. And it's not just Toronto, it's in numerous communities throughout this country. And again, what you find is that there are a few sort of gestures that are made in that regard by people like Minister Raitt or the American Transportation Secretary. But one of the most recent rollouts was the idea to move towards a more sturdy type of rail car that is less subject to an accident, less penetrable. But again, the target for that was 10 years from now. And that to me is, again, just ignoring the fact that yes, we need to move in that direction, but then movements need to be done now, not going forward sort of a decade from now, or in the context of greenhouse gas emissions 85 years from now. So that's a fundamental difference where the Liberals and the Conservatives would divide. But the environment is a strong, and important issue in my riding.
Arif, thank you very much for joining us. Up next, Rob Ferguson from the Toronto Star joins us to wrap up the latest session of the Ontario Legislature. MPPs are back home in their riding for the summer, and Premier Wynne and the Ontario Liberal Party just celebrated its one-year anniversary as a majority government. The Premier has weathered OPP investigations into deleted emails and the Sudbury by-election, a controversial budget, and labour unrest from the province's teachers. The Ontario PCs have picked Patrick Brown as their new leader, and Andrea Horwath appears re-energized after the NDP win in Alberta. I'm joined by Toronto Star Queen's Park reporter Rob Ferguson to discuss this and more. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
My pleasure, Marcel.
It's been a really interesting session that we had just concluded recently. And so give us the highs and the lows of the session.
Well, it was actually a very busy session, and a fair amount got done. There were 11 bills passed, but I think what people are going to remember most are things like the Sudbury by-election scandal and the budget, where we got beer in supermarkets, which will be here by December.
Not in time for summer, but in time for the holidays.
Sadly, not in time for summer, but I guess it takes a while to get this together. And also the sale of Hydro One, which is actually fairly controversial. There are a lot of other bills too, if you want to get into those. There's the distracted driving legislation that people will be very interested in, because starting in the fall, if you are talking on your phone in the car, without a hands-free or a headset or whatever, you could be nailed for up to $1,000. I think the penalties have gone up quite a bit, and 3 demerit points. They've also introduced similar penalties for drugged driving as opposed to drunk driving, because a lot of people are driving high and there's not a specific penalty for that.
Oh,
Plus, yeah. So they've gone that extra step, which is a good move.
So those are 3 of the bills of the 11 that were passed during the session. And then you started at the top of it by talking about the Sudbury by-election. Certainly a lot of controversy, and in fact it's spawned an OPP investigation into that.
Oh yeah, we're still waiting to see if there's going to be charges in that, because not only is the OPP looking at whether 2 officials with the Liberals, the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Premier, Pat Sorbera, plus a Liberal operative up in Sudbury named Jerry Lougheed, who happens to be on the police board and runs a funeral home up there, and he's a big Liberal organizer. There are transcripts of these calls they made to the former Liberal candidate up there, which the opposition parties say makes it sound like they offered him a job so that he would not run as a candidate again, because they wanted defecting New Democrat MP Glenn Thibeault to get that nomination, which he did, and he won.
The OPP is still investigating over the deleted emails, if I recall.
Yeah, and that investigation keeps going deeper down the rabbit hole, because they keep getting search warrants to go after more computer records. So every time they do that, they seem to find more stuff that they want to look into. So I'm not really much of a betting man. I wouldn't want to say how much longer that one will take, but I don't think it's gonna wrap up quickly.
Now, during the election, Premier Wynne campaigned as a progressive, almost on campaigning on the left, but now she seems to be more acting as a government on the right, with the sale of Hydro One and some of the actions that she's done in the budget and elsewhere.
And I think it's partially a function of they don't have any money. They don't have a lot of money. And on Hydro One, for example, they wanted money to improve public transit, because everybody knows the roads around Toronto and Hamilton are generally pretty messed up. There's so much traffic. So they were looking for a way to fund this. And if you'll recall, about a year and a bit ago, she was talking that she wanted new revenue tools for transit. And the NDP and the Progressive Conservatives said, hell is going to freeze over before we let you raise taxes for this. So given the state of the public finances, with the Liberals promising to eliminate the budget by 2018, I think they kind of ended up in a corner. And that corner was, let's see what we can sell, because there was no public appetite for taxes. So, and before the last election, they said they were going to look at selling off what they could do to maximize the value of some assets. Now that's the way they've gone, and there's quite a bit of controversy over that, because I think after the Conservatives back in the late 90s leased off Highway 407 for whatever it was, 99 or 100 years, and that ended up being a huge sweetheart deal for the company that bought it and not so much for taxpayers. I think that has made people leery. So hence we have, along with the NDP fighting the Hydro One privatization, we have the Progressive Conservatives fighting it as well, and they were the ones back at the end of their last stint in power, 2002, 2003, that themselves were looking at privatizing it, but backed off.
So it almost seems like the Liberals and the Tories have flipped positions.
Yeah, there's stuff the Liberals say there's stuff that needs to be done, and there's no more money. They don't want to borrow more because they're trying to eliminate the deficit. So they appear to be stuck in a bit of a hard place. And I was asking Premier Kathleen Wynne at their annual meeting in Collingwood just recently about, is she having trouble selling Hydro One within the Liberal ranks? And she acknowledged that when she was at that convention at Blue Mountain, that she did have quite a few people coming up to her, and it sounded like she had to do some hand-holding and say, well, look, we are selling 60%, but we're starting with a 15% stake. We're going to retain 40%, and the rules are set up so that no single shareholder can have more than a 10% stake. And big decisions will take 2/3 majority on the board. So they think they can, maintain control of Hydro One. But
you indicated, we're 3 years out from a provincial election, and just recently the Ontario PCs nominated or elected Patrick Brown as their new leader. How's the early reviews on Brown?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of him. He has been at the legislature for a question period a few times, but now we're into the summer break, and they seem to have him out on the road. The thing is, he doesn't have a seat in the legislature, so we keep asking him when he's going to get a seat. And at the leadership convention on the day, he kind of suggested he'd like to get one, but he seems to be it doesn't seem to be so much of a priority right now. So we're not sure how soon he's going to end up in a seat. So and the other thing is, there was very little policy discussed at that in that whole leadership race. MPP Christine Elliott was trying to take it that way, and I know her campaign had a lot of policy advisors on it for health and finance and other things, but they really ended up not being very busy at all, because the whole race became old guard versus new guard, with Patrick Brown, who's been an MP in Ottawa for 9 years, as the new guard. So we don't really know a lot about him. We know he's voted a bit on the social conservative side of the party. He has said that, with the current controversy over the new updated sex ed curriculum, that he's more worried about math and science than he is about sex education. But we don't know a lot about him. So at the Liberal annual meeting just recently, Premier Wynne was trying to paint him as a social conservative, and the Liberals will keep trying to do that until he defines himself otherwise. We'll need to see some more policies.
I think the Premier said that she hopes that he'll evolve on some of his positions.
Yes, she went off script to say she hopes that he would evolve, and of course that was a shot at Chatham, Kent, Essex MPP Rick Nichols, who is one of
biggest Brown supporters.
Yeah, one of the biggest Brown supporters in the caucus, and he, of course, back in the winter was saying in the legislature that maybe they should stop teaching evolution along with sex education. So, and then he admitted he was a creationist. So, she took a little jab. That's what politics is all about.
And Andrea Horwath seems to have a little bit of a spring in her step these days after what I think most would agree was a bit of a lackluster start to the session. She seems to have regained her footing on the hydro piece, and as well as what's happened in Alberta.
Yeah, she's had a tough year when you think about it, because they had high hopes for that election last spring, and they ended up losing 3 key urban downtown kind of seats.
Plus,
in
they
Toronto.
lost Sudbury, which was an NDP seat.
Yeah,
won.
and they had won Sudbury, and then they lost it to the Liberals in the by-election in February to Glenn Thibault. So she ended up down a seat, and she took a lot of bit of a drubbing for their performance in last spring's campaign when they were more populist, and some people thought that they were trying to sound like Tories a little bit. So she bounced back. She had a leadership review vote in the fall, which was pretty steady along the lines of the number she had last time, around 75-76%. And she seems to have found her footing again with Hydro One and fighting the sale of Hydro One. She keeps pushing the government to hold a referendum on that. So
what are we going to expect over the summer leading into a potential federal election? Well, not potential, there will be a federal election. What role is the 3 parties going to play provincially in that federal election?
I think we'll see a fair amount of involvement, because everybody's got a lot at stake. For Patrick Brown, it's the people he came from. The Premier would like to see, she was already helping. She's already been trying to help Justin Trudeau. She was taking some shots at the Harper government on the week at the
convention.
Yeah, the convention about how they handled the Harper government, how they handled the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on what was called a cultural genocide against the First Nations peoples in the residential schools. So she's always out to lend a hand on that. And of course, Andrea Horwath wants some more Orange Crush, because after the NDP won the election in Alberta, the New Democrats are hoping for some momentum, and they're all hoping to ride the respective coattails. And in addition, we may see a cabinet shuffle from the Premier this summer. And we'll also see Patrick Brown, the new Tory leader, put his stamp on the party at some point leading up to the next session.
Rob Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be back in a moment with The Point. Much has been said and written about the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. About this, there is no doubt. Canada has a shameful record in its treatment of First Nation Canadians. While calling it cultural genocide is an extreme characterization, we have failed both morally and ethically in our obligations to respect the culture and traditions of the First Nation peoples. The report hopefully marks a new beginning in addressing our shortcomings. The Commission spent 6 years investigating Canada's residential school system, visiting more than 300 communities. In gut-wrenching testimony, over 6,500 statements were collected chronicling the abuse children suffered as they were torn from their families and sent hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The Commission was created as a result of a class action lawsuit in which the federal government apologized for the residential school system and agreed to create as complete a historical record as possible of the system and its legacy. But is that enough? The Commission produced 94 recommendations they say they hope will heal the relationship between Canadians and Aboriginal peoples. Many seek to correct historical rights and provide the same level of service that most Canadians take for granted, such as language rights, health care, education, and others. Already, the federal government has signaled that it won't accept some of these recommendations, such as an inquiry into the more than 1,200 missing or murdered Indigenous women. The Canadian government's treatment of First Nation peoples has been deplorable. It does not matter what political stripe you wear. All parties and politicians have been responsible for creating this situation. How can we as Canadians allow this to continue? We are viewed as a compassionate and caring society. When an earthquake or natural disaster hits, Canadians donate millions of dollars in aid. Our governments, both federally and provincially, find money to assist. For example, Since 2006, the federal government has donated $1.4 billion to aid Haiti to help rebuild the island. Yet when money is needed to help deal with problems on reserves, we are told there is none available. It's a double standard that bothers me. We can help others, but we can't help our own. Hopefully, the Truth and Reconciliation Report will mark a new relationship between Canadians and our First Nations. We have done wrong by them in so many ways. It's time to correct the mistakes of the past and make amends. And that's the point. That's all for this edition of The Point. Keep up with the show and follow us on Twitter at Watch The Point, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Marcel Wieder. Thank you for watching.